Hello, welcome to Economic Divide with me, Kavitah Wei. Where on this week's show, we will be looking at the situation in Britain that sees the children there going hungry as poverty strikes. Now, Britain prides itself as a modern, developed, and multicultural nation, claiming to have an excellent social service that's designed to maintain the needs and demands of its 66.5 million people. However, recent reports have painted a very different picture of the so-called land of hope and glory, as poverty kicks in harder than ever following the effect of the COVID-19 pandemic and, more so, Brexit. Now, with around 25% of the population living in poverty and 4.5 million of them living in deep poverty, the most severely affected are the children, with Child Poverty Action Group showing that after housing costs have been calculated, just under 40% of British children live in poverty according to IFS projections. The purple line here shows the after housing costs. Now, taking the view on a broader scale, the End Hunger UK charity have published some truly alarming figures, suggesting that, for example, 1 in 4 parents have skipped a meal as they cannot afford to eat. Also, 1 in 4 parents worry about not having enough food to eat and feed their families, and 1 in 8 people in Britain go a whole day without eating any food at all. Now, that's around 8.3 million people based on the entire UK population. As always, here on Economic Divide, we always want to hear from you about this or any other subject, so why not write to us, and we will promise to cover the stories that matter to you. Well, let's now take a look at our first report, which covers a recent story emerging from Britain covering free school meals provided to underprivileged children in Britain, studying the less than impressive food packages that parents are expected to feed their children with.
Please, sir, I want some more.
What?
Please, sir, I want some more.
What's embarrassingly reminiscent of orphanages in Victorian times, British children are facing hunger on a scale not seen since Charles Dickens wrote about Oliver Twist in his famous novel. Yet here we are in 2021, and with Britain undergoing the toughest of times in its economic history as a direct result of the COVID-19 virus, and more worryingly, Brexit, the biggest victims of all the Tory government's failure are the children, with figures showing millions of them are now living in poverty in the towns and cities of Britain. With the country in its third lockdown and figures showing that nearly 2,000 people are dying every day, the UK has had to react by closing down schools and learning facilities across the land. However, the problem does not lie in the children missing out on their education, as painful as that may seem. The biggest point is that for millions of British children, it means that they're missing out on their 1 square meal per day. As for those in poverty, food at home is nothing but a wishful dream. But it's not just the poorest families whose parents or guardians are out of employment that are suffering. As the economic situation in Britain becomes worse, parents who are in work are now finding things tougher than ever, as the purse strings grow ever tighter, meaning sacrifices have to be made.
We've had some people who were very in good jobs lose their jobs. And when they come to us, you can sense the stress and the anxiety because they've always been able to provide for their families. They've never had to get the begging bowl out, so to speak.
For single parents or parents who are unable to work, the situation's even graver, with the United Nations Rapporteur on Poverty, Philip Alston, raising his concerns about how the people in Britain are slipping ever deeper into poverty.
I think the employment statistics are very impressive. I think poor people need to work when they can, but what we see is a huge amount of in-work poverty, and we see those who can't get work for whatever reason because they're just not up to it, living in increasingly dire conditions.
So when Britain asked the government to vote on extending free school meals to underprivileged children during holidays and lockdown, the Tory government of Boris Johnson voted overwhelmingly to not provide the service, causing people to step in and take action, something that we'll touch on later on in the show. But what followed was a sham. Parents who started to finally receive emergency food packages took to social media to complain about the quality and quantity of food being sent to them, with many of them expected to feed their 2 children on half a tomato, half a pepper, a third of a carrot and 1 potato for a whole week, something that children in the most impoverished nations in the world could have done better on, leaving the British government with egg on its face.
Joining me in the studio is current affairs and impact analyst Mahan Abedin and our special guest David Gordon, a professor of social justice and the director of the Bristol Poverty Institute at the University of Bristol. Mahan, welcome. Let me first.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Let me first start with Professor Gordon. Many thanks, Professor Gordon, for joining us. First up, recent images on social media that I'm sure you've seen in the news, and that's the school emergency lunches. Many saying they're falling short of the standards that are expected. The complaints are that they cannot feed 2 children on the portions that are given. Why is the government then allowing standards to slip? And what are they doing to rectify the situation?
Well, Kaveh, that of course is a really important question, and thank you for inviting me on your show in order to discuss these issues. There, of course, is a major problem of an increase in inequality and of poverty in the UK and around the world because of the pandemic. So what we've found is that over the past year, about a third of households have reported a fall in income. And the Food Foundation did a survey in the summer which found that something like 5 million adults were now food insecure, which is more than double what it had been previously. And over the summer, when children were not in school because of the summer holidays, something like 11% of children reported that their families had to rely on food banks in order to supplement the amount of food they had. So there's a real problem because of the pandemic, and it's led to quite a significant increase in the number of the children and families that are food insecure, something that we haven't seen for 50 or 60 years at this kind of scale.
Thank you for that, Professor. Well, Mahan, some truly worrying times for the children of Britain. I'm going to skip what I have written down here, and because you made a comment that not a whole lot has really changed from 20, 25 years ago. Maybe the depth of the problem is a little bit more now. Can you elaborate on that a little bit and put it into perspective for us?
Sure. Well, I mean, food poverty has been a long-standing issue in the UK. I mean, some people trace it back to the late 1970s, the transition from, kind of quasi-socialist regimes of the Labour Party to Margaret Thatcher, who brought in kind of extreme conservatism and so-called the Thatcherite brand of economics. So it's a long-standing issue. And I think it's one that successive governments clearly have not been able to get on top of. And by all credible accounts, it's got worse recently.
Okay, very well. Yeah. We're going to continue on that trend after a little bit as it goes by here. Now, we're going to take a look now at this next report. This next report studies why so many famous faces in the UK are lobbying the government to take action against child hunger and also poverty.
It was not just the parents of children who took to the likes of social media to complain about the shocking food packages that were being made available to British children stuck in poverty. A host of famous faces took the problem on and used their positions and influence to drill home the message to the government that current measures being taken were simply not enough. One of the most prominent campaigners against the treatment of children in poverty in the UK is Manchester United and England footballer Marcus Rashford, who as a young man experienced and lived through the tough times firsthand that are still being seen across the UK today, as explained by Marcus Rashford's very own mother in a recent interview.
I had 3 jobs, and if I didn't do that, we just wouldn't have been able to cook a pot of food. It's just a bit difficult, so Marcus is only telling the story from how he sees it and the words that he's been saying, they obviously come from the bottom of his heart.
Such was the impact of Marcus Rashford on child food poverty in Britain that Boris Johnson and his ultra-elite rich boy cabinet was forced to listen and overturn the draconian measures, earning Marcus Rashford recognition from the Queen in his work in fighting child poverty. It's also seen many others take inspiration from the footballer, and all have contributed in their own way.
This campaign by Marcus Rashford, who is an absolute legend for what he's doing, he's stuck to his roots, and this is our inspiration. I think this is most of the cafes, restaurants around the country are doing it because of him. We have to feed our children.
But in spite of the many famous faces doing their bit to tackle food poverty in Britain, the problem does not just lie with food, as poverty in the UK is much wider and deeper than meets the eye, and is a problem that, according to one volunteer, sees the blame lying solely at the feet of the British government, who have allowed cuts, austerity and mismanagement to bring the people of Britain to their knees as they beg their way out of poverty.
It's not an easy thing to tackle, and it's not just food poverty, it's poverty as a whole. So we're coming back from years and years of austerity. Funding has been cut for so many different services. It's about reinvesting in the community.
Joining me back in the studio is Mahan Abedin and Professor David Gordon from the University of Bristol. Okay, Mahan, welcome back.
Welcome.
Let me go to the professor first. Professor, some famous faces have stepped in to talk about this very important issue of child poverty. You have the likes of people like Marcus Rashford, you have Tom Kerridge. Why should it take such famous celebrities to finally come about and raise awareness and finally kickstart some form of action to be taken in tackling this very important issue?
Well, academics have been warning and NGOs have been warning about this problem for some time. It's although the pandemic has brought it into sharp focus, it's been a growing problem. For 10 years or more, the government has been pursuing policies of austerity, and they've been squeezing benefits for those of working age, particularly families with children, and in particular there have been some rather punitive changes to the welfare budget, particularly for families who are reliant on welfare benefits, who have more than 2 children or who have extra rooms in their household. The government has really squeezed their incomes. Now, during the pandemic, they've raised those welfare benefits for some families, but again, these kinds of ideological squeezes on the incomes of some of the poorest in society are still in place. And it's taken celebrities to complaining in order for the government to suddenly wake up to these problems. They've just ignored all the NGOs and academics and been able to do that because Brexit so dominated the political debate. But the pandemic, reality has hit because of the pandemic, and there is a genuine and real dire problem in one of the richest countries in the world. There should not be a problem of feeding children. It's something that you might expect in sub-Saharan Africa or parts of Asia, but in the UK, it's a scandal.
Okay, thank you for that, Professor. Mahan, let's turn our focus to Marcus Rashford becoming a thorn in the side of the Tory government, it seems, as his campaigns have led to numerous U-turns by Boris Johnson, for example, and earned him an MBE in the process. Why does Marcus Rashford, or anyone for that matter, actually keep defeating public policies that are set by the Conservatives, do you think?
Well, I'm not sure he's actually defeated a public policy, because the policy is still in place. The policy is to, quite literally, to starve people who can't afford it. Because as the professor rightly said, the UK has all the resources it needs to feed everybody in the country. But for ideological, political, and I would actually say cultural reasons, they're choosing not to do that. So they would prefer for kids to literally starve than to provide this universally. Now, Marcus Rashford, of course, he's a celebrity, so he's highlighted this issue. But I suspect that this is going to be a transitory thing. Somebody else may occupy his place. The real issue here is just the whole privatization of everything, including the provision of school meals for children. Now, just a few weeks ago, a private company was actually paid £35 per school meal. Okay, so they were given this tranche of money by the government, and out of that £35, they actually spent £5 on the school meals, and they pocketed the balance. So the result was these grubby meals. Whereas for £35, you could provide a lavish meal.
What
basically.
were the grubby meals?
Sorry?
What would they provide? Do you know?
Well, just, yeah, I mean, the pictures are on the internet. People can just Google it, rusty bread, and potato, piece of carrot, for instance. And so they'd been given the budget to provide us, but they'd chosen not to do so. So privatization is a big issue. And of course the macro stuff that the professor alluded to, Brexit being a huge preoccupation.
Sure.
So I suspect this issue is actually going to get much worse. And the historical trajectory supports that argument, because the UK has been on this trajectory now for 40 plus years. I don't expect to see them come off the ramps just yet.
Okay, thank you for that.
Yeah.
We appreciate both Mohan and Professor Gordon there. Now we're about to take a quick break here on Economic Divide. But don't go anywhere, as we have plenty more coming up after this short message, so stay tuned. Welcome back to Economic Divide with me, Kavitah Wai. Time now to take a deeper look at the UK child food crisis in Britain in our in-depth section. One of the most disturbing stories to emerge, particularly for the British government, is the action being taken by UNICEF, who, for the first time, has had to step in and feed Britain's children. For the first time in 70 years, the UN agency will help fund food parcels, helping to supply at least 18,000 meals to children across Britain. Now, the political ramifications of UNICEF stepping in is a huge embarrassment to the Conservative government, with Deputy Labour leader Angela Rayner actually stating that the fact UNICEF is having to step in to feed the country is a disgrace to Boris Johnson and Chancellor Rishi Sunak, who should be ashamed, indeed something that has left them red-faced. But it seems that the UK government is splitting the inequality gap wider than ever, as it simply refuses to tax the super rich into paying to reduce the poverty levels in Britain, with the likes of Boris Johnson, Rishi Sunak, and Jacob Rees-Mogg, all multimillionaires. Seems that the class system in Britain is designed to solely favour the elites. Yet with food packages still arriving unfit for purpose, it seems that the children of Britain living below the poverty line are stuck with food packages as seen on your screens and as you see over here, with 2 children designed to being fed for 1 week. Well, this raises the question as to just how parents are expected to manage as things go from bad to worse. Well, time now to take a look at our final report today, which examines just what the British government is doing to solve the problem.
It's amazing to think that the current government of the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson won an election giving him an 80-seat majority in Parliament. The main surge in support for Johnson came from the voters in the so-called Red Wall area, who were once traditional Labour voters from a working-class background and lived in one of the poorest deciles of poverty in Britain, lulled into voting for the Tories under the false pretext of getting Brexit done. Yet now that Johnson has his feet firmly and securely under the table of the desk at Downing Street, when the poorest people in Britain needed their leader the most, he soon forgot who put him in his place and just how he got there. As a quarter of the British population fall into poverty, with nearly 5 million of those being classified as living in extreme poverty, what then has the government of Boris Johnson done to alleviate the problem? The short answer is not enough. Many people in Britain who are now considered to be in poverty were not in this position prior to Brexit or the COVID-19 pandemic. Yet the schemes designed by the government to save businesses and jobs appears to have fallen short of the goal, as furlough schemes and food packages have all shown to be failures as budgets limit the positive impact on dealing with the issue. It's hence why so many people in Britain have turned to non-governmental sources of assistance and sees Britain relying on the charity of local groups and individuals to see them through the dark tunnel of poverty, in particular when it comes to school children stuck at home with no food to eat.
So here we are now back feeding. Today's almost 50, but we've got another school talking to me this afternoon. I think they're on about another 30 odd children coming on board from tomorrow.
Even charities and goodwill organisations, such as the one being run by Richmond Rugby Club, are baffled as to how the government is failing to act, stating that they could not just sit back and let children go hungry.
Yeah, the politics, that's for the politicians, obviously. We don't want to politicise it, but we've just reacted to something we were doing in the summer, and the thought of kids going hungry over this week and maybe over Christmas as well. Yeah, we can't sit here and do nothing.
With the likes of Boris Johnson, Jacob Rees-Mogg and Rishi Sunak all well into the multi-millionaires club, It seems that the economic divide between the rich and poor in Britain is doomed to grow ever wider and deeper, until of course the day comes when votes are required and suddenly the Tories may just find themselves again knocking on the doors of the poor, making promises that they're just unable to keep.
Back in the studio is Mohan Abedin and Professor David Gordon from the University of Bristol. Mohan, welcome back.
Welcome.
Professor, last question. Measures that are being taken by the UK government and UK-based charities to resolve child hunger. Please tell us, can you give any examples of what is being done to improve poverty conditions, particularly when it comes to children?
Well, the government has invested because of the pandemic, so it's introduced a furlough scheme, so most of the people who would likely have become unemployed have not done so, although of course there are gaps in this safety net, and unemployment has more than doubled, although it's still at a much lower rate than it would have been, and they have increased the benefits. Of course, charities have stepped up and religious organisations, and there's now been mass rollouts of food banks and collections for people to who are having food insecurity to go and get food so they can feed themselves and their children. But we have seen an increase in destitution, we have seen an increase in children going to bed hungry, things which never used to exist 20 years ago and shouldn't exist today. It is an embarrassment. There should be no child going to bed hungry in the UK. There should be no family dependent on food banks, and this has to change.
Well, David Gordon, thank you so much, Professor of Social Justice and Director of the Bristol Poverty Institute at the University of Bristol.
Thank you for inviting me, and
you're welcome.
With the rest of the show.
Well, Mohan, we heard the professor there, and of course, I'd like to find out from you now in the final question. The current government, British government, is made up of an Oxbridge of millionaires only club. How on earth can they claim that they can feel the pain that some of these children are going through in terms of the food poverty that they're experiencing, and then come out and say that we're trying to help them?
Well, the government being made up of elites, again, that's not a new thing in the UK. It's a long-standing cultural thing. And it's just the tip of the iceberg. Look, I fully concur with your guest. This shouldn't be happening. But I fear it will go on happening because, as I stated before, it's not just a political issue. There's ideology here, and there's also culture. So I don't envisage the UK getting on top of this problem. They have all the resources to do it, but they won't. Because there's a long-standing, deep belief there that the state simply shouldn't be doing this.
All right, thank you so much. We appreciate that, Mohan. It's good to see you again. Mohan Abedin in the studios with us. Also, thanks Professor Gordon from the University of Bristol again for his input into the program. Time now to take a look at our regular section, 1,000 Words. Food poverty in the UK is a bitter pill to swallow for the authorities. On the one hand, many children are going to bed with empty stomachs, wondering where their next meal is going to come from, while those are being given some form of aid are left disappointed by inadequate portions and unbalanced diets. For those in the lowest deciles of poverty who do eat, 12% of 4 to 5-year-olds are obese, not from overeating, but from eating processed and fatty foods, many of which are the cheapest and most readily available on the supermarket shelves. With pressure now mounting on the government to resolve the situation, food insecurity in Britain comes with a huge human cost, price that the current generations in the UK will likely carry with them for the rest of their lives, affecting their health, their well-being, and their futures. Don't forget, we want to hear your thoughts on this or any other topic, so do write in and let us know what you think. But for now, that's about all the time we have on this week's show. So on behalf of myself, Kavatavwe, and the whole team here on Economic Divide, thanks for watching, stay safe, and we'll see you again next time.